Which came first for you, spirituality or the passion politics?
The passion politics.
In terms of your passion about political theology, which came first?
In my life?
Yeah.
The spirituality.
Yeah.
As a child, I had a very, very rich, quite unusually rich spirituality. Now I realize it wasn't common. At the time, it just felt like breathing to me to kind of talk to God and have this real sense of God's presence as a child. And I didn't know that was quite a special thing to have, but I had that as a young 8, 9, 10-year-old. So that was definitely first for me, and the rest came after.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
And I've got a microphone as well, so if you've got a question, just pop your hand up and I will come to you. And please do not hold back, because no one will be surprised by this, have like 20 questions, but don't let me ask them all. This is your opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Because I can't hear me. This is a political question. I'm an Anglican and I'm a Zimbabwean, and I was brought up with the narrative that it was white male missionaries who brought Christianity to Africa. So I was very grateful that you reminded us at the beginning of your book that actually Christianity came to Africa before it ever came to Europe. And I feel quite moved to be reminded of that, and it's very important. But the question I wanted to ask, and I know you're not an Anglican, is I have this feeling that the idea of the Anglican communion perpetuates the narrative that I was brought up with, and that maybe it's time for the Anglican communion to be broken up. Sorry, political.
Woo woo. Do you want to take more than one question?
I mean, I don't mind. I mean, I'm not an Anglican, so for me, there's nothing at stake here in this conversation, which is why I can say I don't really know why this thing ever existed to begin with, and what the purpose and the hope of it was. But it feels like, various other kinds of structures that have been set up with a sense of let's have kind of global connectivity and relationships, sometimes with very good intentions. But if you don't understand colonial dynamics and actively work against them, they will be the default. And so I think that's what I think is somewhat inevitable. And that is both about work done in the UK to resist those trends, and it's also about global communities having their minds liberated, right? Bob Marley says, free, what does it say? Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. It's a kind of, I remember talking to a bishop in the Church of England who said, we're trying to decolonize our relationships with this partner church somewhere, I forgot where it was, maybe Uganda, where they won't do anything unless we tell them. That they will say to us, please tell us, give us your books, give us your curriculums. So there's work to be done on both sides, you know what I mean, in terms of what freedom and liberation looks like, in order for there to be a reshaping of those dynamics. So that's what I would say to that, really. There's potential for a beautiful global communion, but the default is always going to be colonial unless it's really worked against.
Great question.
Really
You got
good.
any more?
Inevitably, I have one, so I'll be glad to ask one. You are doing an enormous amount of public theological education. It's one of the key aspects of your work in Durham, as well as your work in this book. And so I'm wondering about doing theology in community together, because lots of books are written for lots of different purposes. This one, including your questions at the end of each chapter, invites reading together. What difference do you think it makes when theology happens in community?
I just think it's the only way. I mean, even when I'm sat writing, I'm doing it with the whole community in my mind as I'm writing, and I'm bringing stories in from my wider community, and I'm writing it in a way that my community can understand. For me, that is the only way to do good theology. We're so used to, the learned scholar sitting alone in a library and thinking of all their very important, urgent questions that have nothing to do with 90% of other people, and that will get you a professorship, right, at Oxford or Cambridge. But we're not used to thinking about theology serving community and the work of theologians as a vocation for others, and for me, that's the only way to do the work. And it's how I learned to read the scripture together with my family around the dinner table. I learned to wrestle with the text together with my family, in the church group, in the youth group. So this is the only way I know how to read the scripture, is kind of checking that I'm not going crazy by hearing what someone else is telling me that they've seen in the text. And actually, that's how we avoid the dehumanizing, wayward interpretations that happen when we just sit with people just like us and decide what a scripture means. I'm challenged out of my hypocrisy by my grandfather's readings of the text. I'm challenged out of my thinking that I'm now a really great academic when my cousin tells me something about this that's a pill to her that I never would have thought of. It keeps me humble. It reminds me that I don't have all the knowledge in the room. And community is essential to life and to the life of theology for me.
Hi, thank you very much. When you were speaking, it brought memories back from about 60 years ago. I was about 8 years old in 1963, and I turned on the TV, watched the news, and I saw the civil rights movement take the effort to break the legal segregation laws in Birmingham, Alabama. And I watched, and this was a church-led movement. So I watched, these kids my age, march out of the 16th Street Baptist Church, who were then met by police who beat them, police who set the hounds on them, police who took water cannons and literally blew them down the street, and then put them in jail into cells that were meant for 8 people, and maybe they had 60 kids in that cell. And the thing is that all the leaders said, we're going to practice the Sermon on the Mount. You are going to love our enemies who are beating us, and I just remember thinking, I don't know how they do that, but they did it. And what that did was that it took the white power structure in a way that if they were so superior, why were they acting the way they were acting, and the kids were acting the way they were acting? And I just thought that was really a way that sort of black spirituality took on the power structure and won.
Thank you so much. You're reminding me, I was in Washington, D.C. in October, and I went to the Smithsonian's African American Museum. And in the civil rights section, they had a lunch counter of a diner where people did sit-ins, where you'd refuse to leave, a diner where black people were not allowed to sit and eat, and people would go in and they had to do training. And they had a video of the training sessions where they'd all be like in a room preparing themselves for what they would face when they went into that space, being spat at, having food poured on them, all that kind of shouted at and all those things. And it was such a moving thing to witness, because when we read these, verses in the Bible, it's loving your enemies as you love loving your enemies, and not repaying evil with evil. It sounds really lovely until you're faced with a scenario like that, and you're wanting to defend yourself, and you're wanting to attack when you're being attacked, and to see that being embodied was such a powerful thing. So thank you for reminding me of that. Thank you.
We have time for one more. I think if anybody has a question that's on their mind, on their heart, now is your opportunity. Please do ask if you would like to.
Sadly, I didn't order any for tonight. That was on me. I've had 100 things to do and I forgot to order any. But you can get it on lots of websites. On the SPCK website. In fact, lots of church bookshops have them as well. So hopefully you can find it. I'm so sorry.
Absolutely do find this book online and where all books are
Yes.
sold. If you haven't got a copy yet, I think, you know, everything we've had a chance to learn about and to listen to in conversation this evening, I hope will really inspire you to get a copy of this book, to be able to go deeply into it. There are a number of other resources that you've offered. There's a playlist at the back, which I have now downloaded and which I'm listening to alongside Sonia Boyce, this amazing contemporary Black British artist. She has a playlist for her Venice Biennale exhibition. And I swear that listening to those two playlists together is absolutely going to change your life.
Wow.
So you've got to do it. You've got to do it. And truly, if you've not had a chance yet to really get into this book, if tarrying is new to you, if it is not new to you, if you are Anglican, if you are not Anglican, there are treasures for you, for all of us, in what you've chosen to share, in the wisdom that you've chosen to offer. So thank you for that gift, and thank you for being here with us this evening, and thank you to Natasha for such interesting questions which have brought this conversation to life for us all. Thank you both.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, sis. Thank you.
Welcome to the next in our online conversation series. My name is Paula Gooder and I'm Canon Chancellor here at St Paul's Cathedral, which means that I look after the theology and learning that take place within the life of the cathedral. This time I'm talking to Dr. Selina Stone, who is a postdoctoral research associate in theological education at Durham University and also the host of Sunday School for Misfits, a podcast that reflects on faith, church and theology. This time, I'm talking to Selina about her most recent book, which is the Archbishop of Canterbury's 2024 Lent book, called Tarry Awhile, Wisdom from Black Spiritualities for People of Faith. And in our conversation, as always, we range widely, thinking about the importance of tarrying, spending time with God. We're also thinking about how Selina's own faith journey has shaped who she is as a person and who she is as a Christian. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as Selina and I enjoy talking to each other. Selina, it's great to have you with us today. We're talking today about your Lent book that you've called Tarry Awhile. Can you tell us a little bit about that word tarry? Because for a lot of people, it's not a word that they would use every day.
Yes, it's quite an old school word, actually. As Pentecostals, we tend to like old school things. And it's a word that I always often heard growing up when we talked about having prayer meetings or particular services where we gather together and really create a sacred space and sacred time where we would occupy the space together as a congregation and do our best to not set the agenda ourselves, but to just gather together and give space to God. And so we would call it tarrying, thinking about that verse where Jesus says to his disciples in Gethsemane, could you not tarry with me 1 hour? And so the tarrying practice is us saying, yes, we will, and often for more than an hour. But it's a really beautiful moment of time to wait with God, of time to experience God together as a community.
Do you always tarry with other people, or can you do it on your own?
Now, I think there are definitely kinds of this that can be done alone. I think that we often talk about having a tarrying service together or tarrying together as a group, because often that might be about interceding together for particular needs. It might be in Pentecostal settings praying for the gift of tongues, which often involves us praying for and with one another. But I often look back and think about many moments in my own life where I've actually spent time alone in what has felt like a tarrying posture. And I think it's very possible that we might have space on our own in what we might often call our daily devotionals, for example, or our morning prayers, where we incorporate elements of tarrying into that time. And in this way, tarrying, I think, connects with many different kinds of practices. I think contemplative prayer is a kind of tarrying. I think that even something like teze singing, often, like I think back to times where we've sung, gathered together, and repeated a simple song or a simple phrase over in song together as a group. And when I first went to Tez, I remember thinking, this feels familiar to me, although it's from a totally different space. So I think that there's ways that these traditions actually are very interconnected.
And if someone wanted to tarry in Lent, because it's yours is a Lent book, are there any top tips that you would give them? What have you learned over the years about what makes good tarrying time?
So I think that on your own, I think tarrying really is learning or practicing the ability of setting your own agenda aside in the time of prayer, which is very difficult. I think it's what silent prayer is helping us to do. It's to enter into the space of prayer, of wanting to spend time in God's presence intentionally outside of the busyness of the day. And it's about practicing the ability of stilling the mind, of bringing to our worries to God, the things that might give us anxiety, the things that we might be carrying with us, and learning how to hold them before God openly, and but not to grasp onto them, to be able to hold them so lightly that they might even drift off in the peace that we find as we sit with God. And we know that we will leave prayer and have to go back into the world where many of these challenges will accompany us. But I think the time of prayer allows us to hold them a bit more lightly. And I think together, the tarrying moment, the tips for the tarrying moment, I think in a collective sense, is really about discernment. I think so many of the times in my own experience, my time of being together with the community of faith has been enhanced because of the gifts of the people around me. And so in that moment, it's not just a moment where I'm expecting to meet with God. It's a moment where I'm expecting that I may actually receive something that is a gift for somebody else. I may actually have a passage of scripture come to mind that I may feel I'd like to share with the community. And this might be exactly what my brother across the room has been praying to God about. It might be a passage that a sister who's come in, who's really at the end of her tether, might be encouraged by. And so one of the most important things is to realize that these moments are not just for our individual spiritual growth, but they're an opportunity for us to assist in the support of the whole community.
So are you good at tarrying? Is it something you do naturally?
Ironically, it's not something that I've done in quite a while, and it's partly because it's been a while since I've been a kind of card carrying member of a Pentecostal church, particularly a Black Pentecostal church, where this is quite common. So I've had experience of this when I visited recently, but it's something I really long for. And it's funny, writing the book, it reminded me of what I'm missing. And so it's on my list of things to do during Lent, actually. And what I want to be able to do is to help to create some spaces where we might get to do this together. But I think it's something that I really love doing. And I think when I look back to my younger years, it was a regular part of my life, was to be in a prayer space and to be experiencing God with me as I read the scripture, as I pray with the congregation, and to also be in that posture of listening for what I might share as well from my own discernment in that space. It's a really beautiful experience, and for some people it's a challenging space, because actually it can take time. You know, these prayer meetings that I'm talking about, growing up, we'd have them for hours, like a 6 p.m. till midnight service prayer meeting, sometimes all the way through a 12-hour prayer meeting from 6 p.m. till 6 a.m. And that involved moments of stillness and quiet, as well as singing and even laughter and prayer and mini spontaneous sermons that anybody would be led to bring to the congregation. It could go on for hours. And so somebody sent me a message to say my memories of tarrying a lot more fun than their memories, which I could understand. um, but I think there's something very beautiful about this tradition that comes out of some of our Black churches.
Yeah, it sounds fabulous. And you've mentioned already Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane saying, "Can you not tarry a while with me?" I always feel a bit sorry for the disciples at that point. It's like, I often have the temptation to have a little nap
Yeah.
while waiting in the presence of God. So I've always kind of felt a little fellow feeling for the disciples. But in the Bible, are there other stories of tarrying? And have you got one that you think is particularly important?
I think there are quite a few. The one that immediately comes to mind is the story of Jacob, and he is about to meet his brother Esau again, and they've had a huge falling out, and they're going to cross over this river, and Jacob sends his family ahead, and he is waiting overnight alone. And while he's there waiting to move into this new space, he has a vision, and he's met by this being. And this is the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel and having this limp when he's finished. And this story, I think, is really powerful because it's something, again, I've heard preached so many times, and it communicates something about the wrestle that many of us go through in the life of faith when when we find ourselves in a difficult moment and we are unsure of what the future holds, and we're maybe disappointed and we're maybe under stress, and we're in a place where we didn't expect to be. And it tells us that God is with us in those moments, first of all. But then this moment of wrestling that happens, and him saying, "I'm not going to let you go until I'm blessed," is this real incredible example, I think, of the agency of the human person in relationship with God and our capacity to be quite stubborn and to persist and to keep on going. And tarrying doesn't have to be a passive thing. It's not a kind of sitting back and whatever will be will be. There is a kind of agency involved in this and saying, I want to bring this to God and I'm going to wrestle with God about this. And I may not get exactly what I want or expected. I'm sure Jacob didn't expect to have a limp at the end, but he was marked forever by the encounter, and his name was changed, and he enters into this new space with his family. And I think there's so much richness in that story. I think about the moment of anticipation, the moment before we enter into the new thing, and how there can often be wrestling and struggle even with God before we enter into those times.
Yeah, it's a really powerful story, isn't it? It's because the word tarrying kind of does communicate kind of a little bit of peace and quiet,
Yeah,
and it's all contemplative, and you're having a nice chill time, and kind of to bring in that whole wrestling with God, I think is so powerful. And that you're never the same again
yeah.
once you've done it. It's a kind of really beautiful image. One of the things I was really interested in the book is that you talk about Black spirituality, but every time you do, you put black in inverted commas. Can you tell us why you do that?
So I mean, I'm now thinking, did I do that all the way through the book?
Maybe you didn't do it all the way through. I
Maybe
just
not.
noticed it
I
from
don't
the
know. It was
time.
the first
Yeah,
time, yeah. So
yeah, yeah.
I wanted to. So in the introduction, I put it in inverted commas because I want to define exactly what I mean. And then once I've defined it, I just say black without the inverted commas. But this is a word that I think can mean a lot of different things to different people. And even as I was writing the book, I was aware that I'm only really talking about my particular perspective on this. There are some Black people who would say, I don't connect with this probably, and others who will think some of this resonates with me, but not all of it. And that is the beauty of culture, that we all sit in it and we feel it from a different perspective and we understand it from a different perspective. But I wanted to have an opportunity to celebrate what I think are some of the gifts that come to us, to the church globally, from African and African descended people, and to really deep dive into some of those traditions and those riches, because I think sometimes they can be overlooked or seen as not serious enough for consideration. So I wanted to take the chance to say, actually, there's some good stuff here that we really should think about some more.
And on that subject, you mentioned also the great Black theologian Anthony Reddy. Shall we just pause for a moment and go, first professor of Black theology in the UK, yay!
Yeah.
He is a fabulous theologian. And he calls Jesus a Black hero, and you mentioned this in the book. Why is it so important to you? And it's such an interesting thing that he does.
I think I love what Anthony does in his own work in thinking about Jesus and the importance of Jesus in Black theology and for Black communities. And this is because within Black theology, the body of Jesus is very important. And I don't just mean that because the body of Jesus is sacrificed and people are healed when they touch the body of Jesus, but because Jesus is born into the body of a man from a minoritized group who experiences what it is to be unjustly treated by systems of religion, by political systems. And so, in talking about Jesus as a Black hero, Anthony is reminding us that Jesus is somebody who Black communities identify with, because so often we know what it is to be minoritized. We know what it is to have to speak up for ourselves. We know what it is to be brought before unjust systems and structures and made to answer for ourselves. And we know what it is to be plotted against too often, individually or as whole groups. And so for Jesus to be somebody who has shared in those experiences in his day and time means that he's a kind of hero for us in particular. And of course, a hero for many people, for many different groups. But I think sharing in that political experience has really great significance. It means that the resurrection has particular significance for us as part of communities who so often don't get to experience fullness of life on this side of eternity. The resurrection reminds us that actually in the life of Jesus, we see an overcoming of evil powers. We see an overcoming of injustice and systems that oppress. And Jesus' life after his death reminds us that God will have the final say over all of these things in the end.
And what difference does that make to you as a Christian? Because I mean, it sounds like that's where the real fire comes for you in your faith. What difference does that make in the way in which you express your faith, in the way in which you live your life? What does that mean?
I think that anybody wants to know that God sees them. And I'm reminded a lot of Hagar whenever I say anything about God seeing us, because of that beautiful way in which Hagar, when she's in the midst of her distress, says God is the one who sees, because God finds her in the desert with her child. And I think that when we talk about Jesus in these ways, it means that communities who've been used to seeing God or being taught to see God as somebody who is distant and far away, who's not really concerned with what we're dealing with, who's not interested in our plight, that instead we begin to see God as somebody who's very close to us. And this, of course, is what we see throughout the text in all kinds of ways. We hear these beautiful poetry, even in Philippians 4, about Jesus who, didn't think equality with God was something to be grasped, but took on the form of a servant and lived among us. And this is the beauty of the Christian story. But so often when we tell it, it sounds like Jesus is really hanging out with the powerful and the privileged. So often when we talk about Jesus, it sounds like Jesus is like everybody else. He values the same kinds of people, supports the same kinds of norms. And instead, what we find is that Jesus is very willing to be identified among those who are really treated with a bit of suspicion, and they're not really welcomed in, they're not really embraced. And I just think it's the most revolutionary thing ever to imagine God in this way, as somebody who is not kind of rubber stamping the order of our social life and the disorder of our politics and our economic systems, who's not endorsing all of that. He's not saying, well done to those who exploit and make lots of money off the backs of others. I think it's amazing to think of God in this way as resisting that. And so for me, the person of Jesus continues to be the most beautiful and compelling part of the Christian story. And why for me, with all of my wrestling, I really can't let it go.
Yeah, and I mean, like you, I love that Hagar story. It's just so beautiful, and that there's that really kind of gorgeous play on words of God Elroy, the
Yeah,
God of seeing. So it's the God you can see and the God who sees you,
yeah,
and how they all kind of, it's that kind of sense. And you're right, it's like, in a way, it's almost kind of the early incarnational stuff, isn't it? About
yeah,
Jesus is made flesh, and we can see him, and he becomes flesh, so we know that he sees us, and
yeah,
that kind of Hagar story kind of is
yeah.
resonant of that. I think is so really beautiful. One of the bits I really liked about in your writing was how, when you started talking about the importance of bodies in African spiritualities, and something that I'm very passionate about kind of the importance of the body in spirituality. Can you tell us why bodies are so important in African spirituality and what that does to our understanding of faith?
I think it's like, I think bodies are so important within African spiritualities. It's almost so organic. Most of the time, if you asked people, they wouldn't even think to say this or to even recognize this as a thing because it's so organic. Um, African perspectives on spirituality are so holistic, it would never occur to us to try to divorce the body from the spirit or the soul, or to uphold the spirit above the body in that way, but to see them as so deeply interconnected, so deeply dependent on one another, and for not only the body to be dependent on God, but actually on connection to community, on the earth, on so many other things. There's such a holistic understanding of human flourishing that involves so many different aspects. And so I think for me, like thinking about the body as core to spirituality, as core to worship, as core to prayer, is it really opens up to really exciting things around, first of all, what we mean when we talk about worship and what can be included in that. It means that people who maybe can't speak or struggle to use words, or whose instinct in the self-expression isn't about words, then have so many more options available to them when we begin to broaden out our understanding of our humanity beyond just what we can say, and we begin to open up expression beyond what we put into words. And so I think it really is quite important, I think, for us to really challenge some of the dualisms that have caused us to imagine that our spirituality depends upon us suppressing the body or trying to leave it on the outside. I think that our emotions are so much a part of spiritual practice. I grew up watching people weep and laugh in church services in the space of 5 minutes because they're overwhelmed with the sense of God's presence, that they're so humble, that they can't even physically respond to what they're experiencing. And for me, it's incredible. It's what I expect to happen when we're experiencing the source of life. It's to me very understandable why that would happen for people. And so I think it's really a really beautiful thing for us to move past these kind of dualistic perspectives on the body. And I do think that this is happening in all kinds of ways where people are engaging more with practices like yoga. Like whatever we feel about yoga, this is a way that many people are tapping in to a spiritual practice that is about the body being involved, and understanding how our wellness, our well-being is connected not only with our with what our mind is doing or what our emotions are, but also how our body is. And so I think there's a lot more understanding about this now, I think, and I think it's really good that we understand how these things are connected.
And in your own faith and practice, what difference does it make that you take your body really seriously? Are there things that you do that are different, or is it just the way you think about things?
I think I probably these days it does make quite a difference because I really was battling a lot earlier on, probably about a year ago, talking with my spiritual director about how I was struggling to just sit on a chair with my Bible and have prayer time in the morning. And I was feeling really guilty about this because that's how I've always been raised to have my morning prayers, is to kind of sat alone with my Bible and maybe my journal. And instead I was saying, like, I go for an afternoon walk every day and I find that to be a really good way to talk to God. But I feel like this is not really proper proper devotion. Um, and she quickly dissuaded me from this way of thinking. And I started to find that walking was a really wonderful way of me connecting in with the body more as I'm engaging in a spiritual practice. And I'm not sure why it does, but it helps me so much. I would say for me, yoga is something that I practice, and I found so many times as I've lay on my yoga mat that I will spontaneously be praying. I'll find myself having a little cry sometimes because I've released some emotion that I didn't know I had pent up in my body, or some stress that I had that's now released. And out of that will come a prayer or a memory of somebody that I want to pray for. So I think there's all kind of ways I've been surprised by how paying attention to the body as part of spiritual practice can really open up things in a really interesting way.
Yeah, no, I'm with you all the way. I had exactly a similar conversation with my spiritual director going, I'm just so bad at praying because sitting in a room on my own, kind of, it just doesn't work for me. And I just sit and think about all the things I'm not meant to be thinking about
Yes.
instead of praying. Whereas if I'm doing something, if I do something with my hands, or if I'm walking, or then I start praying.
Yeah.
And so my spiritual director suggested to me to notice when I pray naturally, and then to do more of that, rather than telling myself I have to sit in a room quietly and not speaking to anyone. I'm really interested to know it's the same for you. One of the things you talk about in the book that I thought was really interesting is the thing about disappointment, and the importance of disappointment in your spiritual life, and how you kind of come to terms with it. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why that's important for you?
Yeah, I mean, this was a really difficult bit of the book to write, actually. I was really struggling with what to put in that final chapter. And then it occurred to me as I was on a walk, ironically, thinking about the final chapter. And I thought, actually, I think I need to write about disappointment. And it was partly because I guess with all books, you're writing out of what you know and what you're dealing with, right? So for me, it's living with disappointment and reflecting for me on how much disappointment had been building up in my journey, and I hadn't really been processing it properly, and how that contributed in part to my huge faith crisis, particularly when my mum died and my faith crumbled into a million pieces. And so for me, talking about disappointment is important because I find that for me, it's been a kind of undetected element of my journey that I hadn't paid a lot of attention to. And in part, it's because I think we're encouraged not to. So, if you pray and something doesn't happen, or you're let down in some way by somebody, you're kind of almost made to think, oh, it's not that big a deal. Just get over it because, God's done lots of other good things. So just don't really worry about it too much. Or, you kind of are not really encouraged to really sit with what that now means for the kind of God you believe in, or what you believe God does or doesn't do. And it opens up a lot of big questions. And as a theologian, I've had space to think some of this through myself. And I wanted to have the chance to say to people that I see this and it's real. And what you're feeling is not illegitimate, it's not invalid, because this is what many of us have had to deal with. And some of the disappointments are so deeply hurtful that it can really send us off on a totally different track. And I haven't suffered anywhere near what I know some people have suffered, and the levels of disappointment that have shattered people's whole lives. And so I thought that it's impossible really to write a book for Lent and to not speak honestly about what we actually encounter in our faith lives. And I know that it might not feel like a positive chapter, but I'm not into false positivity at all. I think our faith has to be honest. And part of what I think is a struggle for people who are not part of the Christian faith is that we're often just not honest about the fact that some things are just horrible and they happen and we can't stop it. And we're in it with everybody else, trying to figure out what to do when life takes a turn that we didn't expect. We don't get to escape from some of the most painful and tragic experiences that human beings have to experience, or not that they have to, but that human beings experience. And so for me, it was so important to give honor to that, and to hold space for people who are really just carrying so much pain and trauma and disappointment. Some of that being what's happened to them by the hands of other people. Some of that being the disappointment we feel in the church. There's so much of that around at the moment. I feel this sense of disappointment that the church isn't what people hope it can be or should be, that it just should be on in kind of by any measure of things. And there's so much of that in the atmosphere, I feel. And so it felt important for me to name that as we're going through that chapter on weeping and thinking about the things that cause us pain in this life and how we can respond to them.
It's really interesting, isn't it, that because in a sense, you know, if I'm thinking about Paul writing about Jesus, that's right at the heart of everything that he says. You know, we proclaim Christ crucified. You know, it's a disappointment's not quite the word for it, is it? But it's kind of the most disappointing outcome of a life in a way,
Yeah,
is that, you know, Jesus, it ended on the cross. But it's
exactly.
not obviously disappointing because it's brought. But why is it that we're so bad as Christians about talking about it? Because it does feel, doesn't it, as though if you ask people to talk about the things that disappoint them or upset them or they feel have let them down, they rush really quickly into talking about kind of how God has blessed them or the hope
Yeah.
of resurrection or all the good stuff. So why do we struggle with it so much, do you think?
I think part of it might be that, like, culturally, we think that in our particular, some of it I think can be cultural. So I think the kind of keep calm and carry on mentality that we we tend to have in the UK is part of it. Is that we want to be seen to be just getting on with things and not dwelling on the past and not dwelling on what's difficult. And we take a particular kind of pride in suppressing pain and trauma and just pretending everything's fine because we imagine that that's what's going to make us acceptable to other people. We might even think that will make us acceptable to God. And I think some of it is theological in that some of us are in traditions whereby everything's supposed to be amazing all the time. And, you know, somebody asks you how you are and you say, I'm blessed and highly favored. And you could be having the worst time ever, but you're going to give somebody a good report because you think that's what you should do as a good Christian. And it just puts so much pressure on the mind to live in this dichotomy between the reality of the pain of what you're going through or what you've suffered and the need to pretend everything's fine. And so I think that it's really about recognizing also that God can handle that honesty. I think some of it can be a worry that God will be disappointed in us if we're honest about our own disappointments. We can feel that God is wanting us to put on a brave face, that God wants us to be, that being faithful to God means always pretending we're happy with how things are and that we're grateful and have no complaints. And this is despite the Psalms, of course, are full of complaints. They're full of people saying, "I cannot believe you've let this happen," and God is fine, it seems, with that. And so, I think there really is space for us to be much more honest in our spiritual practice, and some of us think we can be. And that honesty is also about telling God, I didn't expect this was going to happen, or I expected this would happen, and I'm hurt and I'm disappointed. And to let that sit and to sit with that honesty in the space with God. And in my experience of doing that, I have found God to be so full of kindness and mercy and grace. Never anger or disappointment or frustration with me ever. And reading through the text to see the God we're talking about helps us to come to that point of realizing actually the Jesus we meet in the Gospels, it seems to be forever patient and forever full of kindness, even when meeting somebody who we might think deserves to be told off. And this is, I think, to me, such a comforting thing to think of God in this way when I'm wanting to come in prayer with feelings of disappointment and sadness.
I was thinking about this earlier because we are terrible, as we've said, about talking about our disappointments, except for on social media. When on social media, it turns out Christians are really good at it. And I'm just wondering how you get the balance, because it's almost as though we do it not enough in the right places and we do it entirely in the wrong places. Have you got any thoughts on that?
It's so true, isn't it? And it is there is a time I think when there is definitely a time I think for sharing disappointments beyond just the prayer time. Like that I think needs to be said that there are kinds of disappointment which are not just disappointment. These are issues that need to be talked about and dealt with properly in collectively as well at times or in an organization. So, you know, I talk about the disappointment that we feel, that we've collectively felt every time there's been a new story of a church leader who turns out to be a predator or an abuser. And that is not the kind of thing that I'm saying we just take to God in prayer and leave it there. Our prayer time can be a time when our inner life is able to find some healing and some rest from what we've dealt with. It might be a time where we actually are able to remember who we are in God's eyes, a beloved child of God in whom God delights. And those things are very important. But there's responsibility that we also have, you know, when we hear about these issues or we experience them, those kinds of disappointments, some of them are about legality and about abuse, and they need to be dealt with beyond just your own prayer time. But I think that when it comes to social media, it takes so much discipline to make a decision about when you're not going to speak and when it's actually just unnecessary and unhelpful to voice disappointments. And I think that sometimes it is necessary. So I think that when we're talking about minoritized small groups of people, minoritized groups who are really up against it in any way, shape, or form, it's important that we use what we can to elevate those voices. And it's important that when we're feeling disappointed, as people who have any privilege in the situation, that we use what we have to um, hold up our sisters and brothers when we have the opportunity. But I also think there's a moment when the disappointment that we're feeling is actually can't produce anything good probably in on social media. And so it's about discerning what is the right thing to do with my words at this time, and how do I respond in a way that's actually going to be constructive, that's not just about me letting off steam or trying to embarrass or shame someone, but what are these, how are these words actually helping to move us forward to something better than what we have now. And I think if we can pause and ask ourselves those questions, like what is the real motivation and even the primary motivation of what I'm about to tweet or post on Facebook or whatever else, we might actually do better. And I have to do that all the time. I've deleted about 1 million tweets because I realized this was just about me letting off steam or wanting to send an indirect tweet about a situation. If I really want to make a difference, I can write an email to somebody who has power to do something, or I might actually organize something that might mean we might actually be able to make a change in real terms. Because change making on Twitter to me is very questionable. I'm not sure how much actually does change. It really feels a lot of the time like we're just burning, like we're just letting off steam.
Yeah, and that's the really crucial thing, isn't it? Is the difference between letting off steam and voicing lament. Kind of, you want to put them as the two, because
Yeah.
because I love the way in which you kind of looped in the Psalms of Lament in the Old Testament, and how actually the Psalms of Lament, and they're not letting off steam. Well, sometimes they are, aren't they? Sometimes they are really just having a proper moan. We read the Psalms all the way through. In morning prayer on a regular basis, and I kind of sometimes I think, all right, now you're just moaning, but a lot of the time there is something kind of really profound about bringing the reality of the world to God.
Definitely. And there's a
Yeah,
way that they do it that allows other people to also share. Because we're reading those Psalms centuries later and we're finding connection with what's being said, because the more things change, the more things stay the same. And they
yeah.
speak to us now, they give us permission now to speak the truth about our experience. And so I think that that kind of positive kind of, and not positive is not the right word, that kind of it's a holy response, lament is, to injustice and to evil and to the things that cause us distress. And that is very important that we do that, and discern when we're actually doing that and to do that well, but to not stray into just creating strife and stirring up anger that is not actually helping people to process in a helpful way what they may also be dealing with, and to know how to act as a response.
I really like that idea of the kind of the holy response of the kind of bringing it, and there's something about redemption in that as well, isn't there, which feels quite important. So we've been talking about your book, which is a fabulous Lent book. Tell me about Lent and you. What do you is some Lent something that you observe on a regular basis? What do you do during Lent?
I recently got into Lent in the last few years, and I feel like I'm more prepared this Lent than any other Lent, partly because of the Lent book, because I feel like Lent catches me off guard most years. Like it seems to come by quite quickly after Christmas. and all of a sudden it's Lent and you're thinking, what am I going to read? But I always get a Lent book, and I try to build in a little retreat or some spiritual practices each year. So a few years ago, I did a retreat day just right at the start of Lent, and then another one just before Holy Week began. Another year I did a Holy Week retreat, which was absolutely wonderful. Or I'll buy a book and I'll read some of it every day. I journal quite a lot anyway, so that I'll make sure I do that throughout the period of Lent. And I may decide that I'm going to do some fasting during Lent. I might decide on 1 or 2 days a week where I'm going to fast each week during Lent. And I try to do something that keeps me focused on the season that I'm in, because I don't want it to pass me by and I haven't had taken advantage of the moment. And it really feels to me like an opportunity for a kind of spiritual spring clean, to kind of open all the cupboards and have a look around and see what's going on in there, and to see what I need to throw out or what I need to kind of take another look at, and how I need to look after myself, look after my neighbors, think about my actions and how my behavior is affecting the world. Think about how aligned I am with my vocation, with what I'm doing with my time, with what I'm doing with my money. These are all things that for me come to the surface during Lent. So I really love it. I think it's a really good time. And I didn't grow up with Lent at all, actually, but it's something that I'm finding indispensable now. It's my kind of yearly checkup, if I can put it that way.
Selina, thank you so much. Thank you for the book, which I know lots of people will enjoy reading. And thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you so much, Paula.